We have a lot of ground to cover. Happily, I can exhale now after having held my breath for 5 minutes. And we're going to cover 4 years of the German occupation of Paris, a short revolt that freed the city, and then we're going to save Paris fashion all in the next 45 minutes, which may mean you won't be able to read every single thing I've written on every single screen, but unless I'm mistaken, this is being recorded and will be on the Fort Walla Museum Facebook page. Yeah, perfect. Okay, let's go. So German troops entered Paris on the morning of the 14th of June in 1940. A couple of days later, General Charles de Gaulle flew out of France for England, where he managed the Free French enterprise. And then there was an armistice signed on the 22nd of June, so a week after the Germans arrived. Hitler showed up the next day to take a tour, and in the photo on the left, he's with a couple of his officials who were familiar with Paris, who were given the opportunity to show him around town. For those of you who don't remember your World War II history, or in fact, you never knew it, or maybe like me, mostly know it from the movie Casablanca, when the Germans invaded France, for the first 2 years, they occupied the northern part of the country and the entire seacoast. And there was a puppet government established in Vichy, which was a spa town in the southern half of France. And the Germans allowed that for a couple of years, and then they ultimately occupied it as well. Paris was liberated on 25th of August, 1944. And then about 9 months later, 8 or 9 months later, the war finally ended. There was obviously a big propaganda machine going on in Paris. This is the Chamber of Deputies in 1941. And as I tell you on the caption, the banner says Germany wins on all fronts. There was one of these banners on the Eiffel Tower. The V began as a resistance symbol for victory, but the Germans appropriated it and also put some of these big V's around town. During the occupation, of course, there was food shortages and there was food rationing. It was not a happy time. About 50,000 Jews died in concentration camps after being removed from the greater Paris region. Other groups, including Romani people, Mediterranean immigrants, were also taken out of town or discriminated against, or both. Here are a couple of views that demonstrate that the German presence was a real thing. A couple of German soldiers on the Champs-Élysées, German officers in the Louvre Museum. And what matters to us in this story is that during the occupation, the Paris fashion industry was put in pretty grave danger. As I tell you here on this slide, one of the things they were forbidden from doing, included exporting, advertising, or making a profit. By the time they had arrived in town in June 1940, they already had a plan to transfer the entire fashion industry to Berlin and Vienna, to make them the new cultural center of the new Europe that they were trying to reinvent. And 6 weeks after the occupation began, they forcibly seized the archives of the Chambre Syndicale, which was the Association of Couturiers. And the documents they took included design documents and things related to exports, trade schools, and of course, files on foreign buyers. Lucien Lelong, who was the president of the industry organization at the time, went to Berlin in 1940. He secured the return of the archives, and while he was there, he argued that fashion couldn't be removed from Paris and survive with any vitality, partially because the city itself was a continuing inspiration to couture, not to mention the fact that there were many, many specialized workers working in small ateliers that were involved in some small corner or another of the industry. And I'll give you a statistic in a minute about that, but there were on 14 different occasions that the Germans tried to destroy the Paris industry in favor of the industry being moved to Berlin and Vienna. So the statistic I promised, in the 1940s, the fashion industry in Paris employed more than 30,000 couture workers and nearly a total million jobs. So one of the interesting things that you read about when you learn about the Théâtre de la Mode is that when the British and American women who were part of the armed forces came to Paris, they were scandalized because it didn't look to them like French women were wearing clothes that showed the kind of austerity that had been practiced in England and in the United States and elsewhere. And a lot of that had to do with creative ways of responding to the occupation. French women did any number of things that they could to sort of use their resistance to the suppression of fashion as a way of making a political statement. And I unfortunately don't have any photos for you, but one of the really big ways that they did this, apparently hundreds and thousands of very extravagant hats were invented from materials that were available. It was a resistance tool. French women used hats and other things to demonstrate their displeasure with the Germans. And I should point out in my caption there that one of the things they did was paint their legs to look like they were wearing stockings when they didn't have them, which seems kind of extreme to us now, but that just speaks to the abundance in which we live at the moment. So on the 19th of August, by the 19th of August, the Allied invasion of Normandy began on the 6th of June, 1944. And by the 19th of August, so about 2 months later, there were Allied forces near Paris, but not really planning. Paris wasn't one of their strategic goals. However, on the 19th of August, French patriots in the city revolted against the German garrison that was there. And this caused General de Gaulle to basically beg the Allied commanders to detour to Paris, to take it back from the Germans, especially because they had heard that Hitler had told the Germans in Paris to destroy the city as they withdrew. And so the Allies made a detour and came in to Paris. On the 25th of August, General Eisenhower was there, and on that day, the German garrison surrendered. The next day, on the 25th, a number of Free French troops had entered the city, some American troops had entered the city, and on the 26th, there was a massive parade. Here are Free French troops, the Second Armored Division, French Second Armored Division, that were part of a parade on the 26th of August. Here's General de Gaulle as part of the parade. You can see the Arc de Triomphe in the background. They are a parade route that went from the Arc de Triomphe to the Notre Dame Cathedral. And you can tell from this photo, amongst some others I'm going to show you, there was a lot of enthusiasm for this. The German yoke had been broken. The Allies had arrived. People, thousands, actually almost 1 million people or more than 1 million people saw the parade. And be sure and notice in this photo that there are people standing on the balconies, people looking out the windows, anywhere they can get a vantage point to see the parade. This crowd at the Place de la Concorde is huge. And the thing that's important to understand about this, in this same location, on this same day, there were still snipers in buildings shooting at people. And this is a photo of the Place de la Concorde, 26th of August, 1944, people looking for cover because of snipers. Obviously, all of the Germans who were still in town were rounded up. I'm omitting photos of Nazi sympathizers who were French also being rounded up and treated rather roughly. American soldiers had first gotten into town on the 25th. This is a photo of them marching on 4 days later. And again, a ground level shot of soldiers from Pennsylvania's 20th Infantry Division. It's kind of hard to talk about this without getting a little bit choked up, because some of us who are a little bit older, it either was part of our history or was immediately before we were born. And figures like Charles de Gaulle and of course Dwight Eisenhower, we remember them from various things that happened relative to period news. And a lot of us had relatives who in some way or another were involved in the military conflict during World War II. So having raced through that, and I would encourage you, if you're at all interested, you can just Google German occupation Paris or liberation of Paris, and you can go to any number of websites, especially given that the 75th anniversary of that was not that long ago. So now we're going to jump to Tdlm and understand why it was important for saving fashion as we know it now. Of course, in late 1944, the war was still going on in Paris. There was a great need for relief. People had lost their homes, people had no income, people had no food, people had almost no clothing. And so a man named Raoul Dautry, who was president of the main French aid organization, talked to Robert Richie about a project to raise funds for war relief. Robert Richie was the son of a designer named Nina Richie, and they had founded a fashion house in Paris in 1932. Nina Richie was the designer, Robert ran the business side, and at the end of the war, he was also the marketing and PR person for the Chambre Syndicale. So he took this idea of the fashion industry doing something to promote war aid to the Syndicale, and a man named Lucien Lelong, who we've already met because he'd already kept Paris fashion from moving to Berlin. He was president of the organization at that time, and in October of 1944, they approved the idea. They hadn't crystallized the idea, but they knew they wanted to do something as an organization to raise relief funds. Richie and a fashion journalist named Paul Caldagues were tasked with organizing the venture, and one of the very first ideas that they had was to get really prominent Paris artists, many of whom were involved in theater, ballet, opera, design, because Paris fashion and in vogue art in the city had kind of existed hand in hand together since the first decade of the 20th century. So the initial thought was to stage a gala, and these couture dolls would be created, and then everybody who ordered one, they would sell a copy of it. And I just want you to imagine how little money you could raise for the amount of time you would have to invest to do something like that. But fortunately, it was a work in progress. That wasn't what they ultimately decided to do. And the reason they were talking about dolls at all is because by 1944, the Paris fashion industry had for centuries created fashion dolls that got sent all over Europe displaying the New Year's fashions. And so if you were able to afford it and operated in circles where it mattered, if you lived in Germany or Scandinavia or Istanbul, Constantinople or London, you would know what was current in Paris fashion because these dolls would show up and give you an idea. And so that was where the impetus for them came with Théâtre de la Mode. During the process, a woman named Eliane Bonneville, who you'll meet again in a minute, came up with the idea that it would be a good idea to create a new kind of doll for this project so that they didn't look like toys. And so she had an idea, and you'll learn about it in a minute. The Spanish sculptor, a Catalan sculptor named Joan Rebel, was asked to create the heads for the dolls, and every single head was different. Every single head was a little sculpture. And then Ricci himself was the one who came up with the final format, and he decided, why don't we create a bunch of small theater sets and we'll display these dolls in the sets. And so it should be called Théâtre de la Mode, the theater of fashion. So the artists, the set designers and couturiers had complete freedom to create both the sets and the clothing that they wanted to create. The couture houses agreed to create 1 to 5 outfits depending on their size and what they specialized in. For instance, some of the furriers didn't do a full 5 mannequins because their specialty was furs, and that would have seemed like too much. But nonetheless, people played to their strengths. And then a rivalry, it was originally decided that it would simply be dolls and attire, and then it was the idea of the fashion houses to create shoes and handbags and umbrellas. Some of them even created underwear. So people got serious, and the mannequins, as you'll see, are just a little over 27 inches tall. So they were creating works that were much smaller than usual, which required much more detail and fine sewing than usual. And everyone agrees in the historic record that it took at least as much time to dress one of these dolls as it would to dress a full-time human. So what's important to understand about this, that's sort of the idea behind the thing, but the context in which they were created, okay? Paris was liberated in August 1944. The Théâtre de la Mode opened to the public in the spring of the following year. So during that 8-month period, the war was still being fought elsewhere in Europe. Infrastructure was still being dedicated to moving goods needed for the war. Raw materials were still being directed to the war effort. That year happened to be extremely cold, and there was an almost complete absence of heating materials. There was a shortage of shoes, there was a shortage of clothing. So all of this work on the Théâtre de la Mode was done during this period when people were in really pretty significant misery and they didn't have the basics. The interesting thing about the food shortages during this period were bad, but they actually got worse at the end of 1945. Bread was rationed beginning again in 1945, and in March 1946, so almost a year after Tdlm opened, the average Parisian was surviving on 1,400 calories a day, which is fewer than they consumed during the occupation. Those of us who've ever counted our calories know that 1,400 calories a day is not a lot of calories, not enough to make you ever feel full. So here are a couple of our heroes. Robert Ricci is on the left. Lucien Lelong is on the right. This is a 1945 photograph, one of a series taken by a photographer named Béla Bernard, who was a Hungarian man living in Paris who ultimately had a press agency there. And on Flickr, there is an exhibit of his 1945 Théâtre de la Mode photos. There are about 200 of them there. And it's a crime what I can't show you. Those are great photos. And if you want to get directed, you have to figure out a way to get a hold of me at the museum, and I'd be happy to send you the link. So these two plus Paul Caldeggs were the ones responsible for the Théâtre de la Mode being conceived and coming to fruition. It opened on the 28th of March in 1945 at the Louvre. It was supposed to remain on 1 month. It was held over into May and was in fact still on view on VE Day when the war ended. Here's, we're going to race through these. I'm sorry. These are pages from the 1945 Paris catalog. On the left are your sponsors and your dignitary. On your right, under the les décors, are the people who design the stage sets, their names. The personage are the people who created the mannequins by hand, every single one, 200 plus. And then these pages list the 1945 couturiers, the hat makers, the hairdressers. And I should say that the 1946 version of this, there were 52 couturiers. So in the introduction to the catalog from which the pages I just showed you came, Lucien Lelong wrote an introduction, and this is a really important thing to bear in mind. He says, it's not, the Théâtre de la Mode is not intended to represent luxury or lavish use of materials, because remember, we're immediately post-war and people's belts are pretty tight. It is instead a proof of ingenuity and good taste. And when you read the records of where they had to go to find the materials they needed, it is definitely proof of ingenuity. And then he says, artists, sculptors, and theatrical decorators have contributed to this ensemble because it is our desire to present it as a purely artistic manifestation. The Théâtre de la Mode was created for two reasons. One was to raise money for relief, and one was to show the world that the Paris fashion industry had survived 4 years of occupation and that it was reopening for business again. And those were the two main reasons, and that they weren't trying to toot their horn, be honest, and they saw it as a service to the world that they were doing this. And the fashion houses who made these mannequins were not paid to make them. It was all volunteer labor. So those of you who know the Louvre, you will see about at the right center is the pyramid. And so if that, using that as your orientation, if you're standing facing the pyramid, what we think of generally in the West as being the Louvre is in front of you. And in the northwest corner of the complex is the Pavilion des Marsands, which is where the Théâtre de la Mode opened in 1945 and stayed on view until May. The show during roughly 2 months, almost 2 months, more than 100,000 visitors visited the show. 1 million French francs were raised for war relief. That seems like a lot of money, except that at the time, a French franc was only worth 2 cents in American dollars. On the other hand, a US dollar at the time was equivalent to about $14.72. So I did the math for you because I didn't want you to be trying to do this number in your head. I sure couldn't. In 1945, the Paris showing in Théâtre de la Mode raised more than $294,000 in today's money. And then it went to London, it went to Leeds, parts of it went to Barcelona, Stockholm, and other places. So it raised a lot of money during its 1945 iteration, and then it did pretty well in 1946 in North America as well. So we'll look briefly at the three individuals who were responsible for creating the mannequins. You're going to have a dickens of a time trying to read all these labels. So I encourage you to do one of two things or both. You can come back and look at the recording of this on the Fort Walla Walla Museum's Facebook page or website, wherever it is. But there are two online exhibitions about Théâtre de la Mode on the Maryhill Museum of Art's website. Again, if you can't figure out where they are, send me an email and I'll get you to them. One of them is about the history of the Théâtre de la Mode. The other is about just the decors, just the 20 stage sets that were created in 1945 and 1946. So what we have here is we have a photo on the right of Eliane Bonneville, who was the person who conceived of this mannequin form. And on the left is an undressed mannequin from the museum collection. And you can see how it has a structure that's created from a wire limbs, a plaster head, and then hair, which I'm saying in quotes. Interesting thing about Eliane, she's the person who, when the show traveled, she always went with it to make sure everything was installed safely and correctly, including a couple of the venues when in 1990, when after the mannequins had been sent back to Paris, they were conserved and in Paris, and then went on another traveling series, and she also attended them during that time. On our left is Jean Rabel, who did the faces. On the right is Jean Saint-Martin, who did the many, many mannequins, more than 200 mannequins. And I just looked at the clock, so I'm going to talk faster and go faster. Okay, the decors, the stage sets. In Paris, several of the stage sets were sort of created as fantasy lands, and many of them were of specific locations in the city of Paris. So this one, which is on view at the museum right now, is called the Matchless Garden. This one is also on display at the museum right now. It's called the Enchanted Grotto. This stage designer was a young man who was only 20 at the time. And you will see most of these stage sets that were shown in Paris were not shown in North America. These two I've shown you were not, although the artists produced other sets. This one is called The Port of Nowhere. It was only shown in Paris in 1945, and the only photos I've seen of it are from the 1945 Paris catalog and details of it in the Berlin photos. This one also was only shown in Paris in 1945, and it's called Morning in the Champs-Élysées. And the catalog comment in 1945, and all of these comments at the bottom and quotes are from the period catalogs. And he's saying, if you did not know the charm of a fine morning in spring in the Champs-Élysées, you do not know one of the most characteristic charms of Paris. And so now we're beginning to look at the first three sets were sort of imaginary locations. Now we're moving to very real locations in Paris at the Palais Royal, which was a famous area for boutiques. André Dignemont created another, this one, all of these that are in color are in the Maryhill Museum of Art collection and were created between 1988 and 1990. Everything that's in black and white has been lost. You can see the spires of Notre Dame in the background and the Seine flowing around the island there. This version, a different version of it showed up in New York and San Francisco in 1946. Here's another one, again, a famous shopping area in Paris. Jean Saint-Martin, who created the mannequins, this is one of his sets, and he again used wire. This is an interior that's really fascinating to look at, and I'd love to see it in color, but I've only ever seen it in black and white. This one is extremely popular. It's celebrated a lot. This is the recreated set we have at Maryhill. We don't have a big enough space to display it. And you can see it's a large stage set, and then there are 3 levels of theater seats that also have mannequins in them. And this is the set that seems to appeal most to modern sensibilities. And it's the only set of the 20 that make any reference at all to the war experience in Paris. And it's based on a movie by René Clair, a famous French filmmaker named René Clair, My Wife is a Witch. So this one and the theater were also shown in New York the next year, but none of the others were. They were all new. This is finally our sculptor who did the faces. This is his stage set. It was a carousel. And in this one, you can see he has sort of adult size mythic figures in it, but the North American version was little cherubs. This is briefly the exhibition for history for 1945 and 1946. When the show appeared in London, the Queen came for a private viewing. So you'll see all the cities in Europe where Tdlm went in 1945, and then you see the 2 venues in North America that occurred the next year. So here are the North American venues. This is a home on Madison Avenue at 50th Street in New York. This is where the show was seen in New York. And this was a home that was built for Henry Villard. Some of you with an awareness of the history of railroads will remember that name. He moved into it about 3 months before. He had it built. It's a phenomenal structure. He moved into it and then declared bankruptcy about 4 months later. So again, this is a page of the from the program, and what I'm going to ask you to read in little tiny letters down here at the bottom. The last 2 lines are reference the fact that Christian Berard's theater and Jean Cocteau's tribute to René Clair are there. But if you look at the lines above that, there are 3 scenes that are called night scenes. There are 3 scenes that refer to Paris, and 2 lines above that are 2 more sets that are called the street fair. So the presentation was a little bit different. Here are the 2 street fair sets as they appeared in 1946. They were more or less a contiguous scene. They were thematically the same, but they were also created by different artists, and so they are fairly different. I said that the Paris version of this was a little bit different than the New York version, and you can see that there are storefronts to the left and to the right of the curtain surrounding the women who are coming down the steps. Jean Saint-Martin's wire view of Paris in North America was very different because he picked a different scene. He moved his columns to the right and made them round rather than square, but that was his contribution in North America. This is the one North American set that was created in 1988 to 1990. And that's why it's in color, because this is a recreation set. As it appeared in North America, it was actually a 3-dimensional set as opposed to being 2-dimensional like it is now. I call it a temple of love only because there's about a 3-sentence description of it in the 1946 catalog, and it says it's a temple of love. So that's the best I can do for a name. This is simply called the scenery for a comedy ballet. And I said many of these set designers were well known from working for the opera and working for ballet and theater companies. And so this is one of his scene for a comedy ballet. Henri Beaurepaire, who I told you was 20 when he got involved, this is his set in North America. And it was one of what was called a night scene. Okay, so now we'll move on quickly to mannequins. And obviously, it was a lot of work to create the mannequins, to sew the mannequins, to prep the mannequins. There was a lot of time spent crafting hair, making shoes, making handbags. I spoke earlier about Lucien Lelong on a couple occasions, and so since he is one of, as I said, one of the heroes of the story, these are a couple of his things that were in the 1946 show. At the time, in 1946, Christian Dior was working for him, and the people with better fashion knowledge than I have are always pointing at things in the Lelong fashions to say this is obviously the work of Christian Dior because, so there you go. This is Robert Rishi's mother, Nina Rishi. On the left is her with one of her 1945 mannequins, and the mannequin on the right is from 1946. Madame Carvin, photos from 1945 on the right, and one of hers from 1946 on the left. Madeleine de Roche on the right in 1945, prepping mannequins, her mannequins, and then on the left, one of her mannequins from 1946. So here are a couple of people that are interesting because, and I'm not going to go into it at great length, but there's been an interesting book written about Paris during the occupation. And lest we ignore certain history, I'm going to show you 3 photos of fashion designers who were Nazi collaborators, Jacques Fott being one of them. And many of the designers created work for the wives of German officers, but only a very few of them sort of went above and beyond that and were involved in a number of social events and other undertakings. But Jacques Frat and his wife were among that crowd. Marcel Rochus was another one. And some of this in some cases had to do with people having personal ambition and feeling after 1940 that if they were going to get ahead in the business, then they just needed to be collaborators. And finally, Grafe is the third one that I wanted to point out. At the opposite end of the scale, this is work by Jewish couturiers who lived in Paris during the occupation. And Jacques Heim on the left, I only have room to show you one of his. This is beachwear. He's important if you don't remember anything else. He's one of the very first people to create a two-piece woman's swimming suit. And when someone else followed it up with an even skimpier one, he's the person who came up with the name bikini. So Jacques Heim. And then on the right, this was created from the workshop of Rose Vienne. The founder of it, the woman who founded it, was sent out of Paris and died during the Holocaust. This work was designed by her son, and then the following year, he went out of business. So we'll just race through a couple more, because I know some of you out there, this is why you showed up tonight, right? Because these are what you want to see. And I just want people who are unfamiliar with the Théâtre de la Mode to see the range of work. Yes, there are a lot of little black dresses. There are a lot of ball gowns, evening dresses. And going back to that decor that shows the theater was a really important part of Paris life. And for a lot of us in the US, particularly those of us living in rural areas, we don't necessarily understand why that was the case, but you're just going to have to believe me. It was a big deal and people went wild over the theater decor. And when you see the embroidery, for instance, on the dress on the right, you understand what I said earlier about the ateliers that focused on very, very small aspects of the industry. So Théâtre de la Mode came to Maryhill Museum. The 1946 iteration was shown in New York and San Francisco, and it did not return to Paris. It was stored in the city of Paris department store in San Francisco until 1952, so for 6 years. And then the department store, with the help of Alma Spreckels, managed for it to be donated to Maryhill, where it was shown between 1952 and 1980, essentially like this, freestanding mannequins without any decors. So I threw this cartoon in here because between 1988 and now, a whole lot happened. Basically, the museums were, the costume, the clothing was rediscovered, so to speak. It went back to Paris, it was conserved, and then it traveled around the world again. And so we're going to just jump from the middle of this equation when we're glossing over a lot of things. And just so you know, after it reopened in Paris, in the same wing of the Louvre that I showed, which I showed you a picture before, it opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1990. It also played at the Imperial War Museum in London. I can't even remember where else now. It played in Tokyo, it played in Honolulu. 3 sets went to the Phoenix Art Museum just about 10 years ago. So after being conserved, it had a pretty active life. Here are 2 of the sets that are on display right now. They're the first 2 I showed you as we went through the inventory of them. I took this photo with my cell phone last month, and this is what you'll see if you come this winter. Just a couple of quick things about why Tdlm is and was important. In 1945, it was important that the French public discover that couture was still in existence and that the creativity and fine workmanship hadn't been lost. Second, it illustrates the link between contemporary Parisian art and fashion, and that had been an ongoing relationship since the first decade of the 20th century. For those of you who are fashion historians, it's the missing link between wartime fashions and Christian Dior's 1946 new look. And I apologize, I didn't even show you a picture of the new look. But if you Google new look, you will find it. And it's basically outfits with waists like a wasp would have, and padded shoulders and other details. And then finally, one of the real easy reasons to recognize it's important, there is no other collection showing 172 outfits from 52 couturiers during a single season. This is all mostly what I want to tell you, but there's a footnote about what you need to know. In 1948, a sort of a grassroots effort in the United States collected 700 boxcars of food that were sent to France. And I know you're thinking, what has this got to do with anything? And then the next year, a boat came from France with 49 boxcars, one for each state, and then one each and then another one that was shared by the District of Columbia and the territory of Hawaii. And that was called the Mercy Train or the Gratitude Train. And I have to confess that for the first couple of years, I thought, what the heck was the Mercy Train? Because I'm thinking it's white boxcars with red crosses, right? Well, it's because I was spelling mercy wrong. It's MERCI, thank you. Okay, so just to know, the Washington Mercy Train boxcar is located in Yakima. Some of the objects are in Puyallup. The Oregon Mercy Train boxcar is now in North Bend, and its objects are scattered into a couple of museums. Why it matters is that the Brooklyn Museum is in possession of 49 mannequins, one for each state and one each for Hawaii, shared by Hawaii and British Columbia. This uses Tdlm technology. It uses the same designers who created work for the Théâtre de la Mode. And rather than being contemporary work, this shows mannequins dressed in French attire from 1709 to 1909. And for those of you who like dolls and aren't familiar with this collection, you'll definitely want to be going online and Googling Mercy Train dolls, because, for instance, on the left here is the one created by Marcel Rochus. We talked about him later. Maggie Ruff, we talked about her earlier. Madeline DeRoche, we talked about her earlier. Nina Ricci, we talked about her earlier. These are an inch or two. They're either an inch or two taller than the Théâtre de la Mode mannequins, or they just have bigger hats, so the dimensions come out differently. But in the genealogy of the Mercy Train mannequins, you have to understand the Théâtre de la Mode for these to make sense. They were created just 3 years later, and they're just really significant things for us to understand. And that is all I have to say.
All right, thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Looks like an absolutely fantastic exhibit over at Maryhill. And quite a lot of history attached to it. So let me see some Q&A. Okay, so question, how were the fashions shipped across Europe and eventually the US, especially the large set pieces, without damaging them?
In wooden crates, I imagine. And when we loaned them, we had custom-made wooden crates. I mean, obviously the stage sets come apart, but I would presume in wooden crates. We are in the process of loaning a few Théâtre mannequins internationally in the next year, and those will all be leaving Portland in custom-made wooden crates.
Okay. Who was visiting the Louvre show, and how did everyday Parisians react or feel about the theater themselves?
Well, I'm going to have to assume that admission, well, let me do the math backwards. If 100,000 people visited the show and 1 million francs were raised, that means everybody who went in paid 10 francs, which is the equivalent of 20 cents, although it would have been equivalent more than that in today's money. Everybody went, because obviously couture was a point of pride in the city. And once it opened, I mean, there was an inner circle of people who knew about it, but the historic accounts say the word of mouth was amazing. And so people just came, and that's why instead of opening in March and closing at the end of April, it stayed open into May, because there was still demand for it.
Okay. I didn't understand the Mercy Train connection to the Brooklyn collection. Was it fashioned as a thank you to the Mercy contribution?
Okay, the 49 fashions at the Brooklyn Museum were part of the Mercy Train, and they were collected. They were originally going to be part of a national tour, but they instead just stayed at the Brooklyn Museum and were shown there. So what I was doing was showing you another set of wire mannequins about French fashion that descended from the Théâtre de la Mode, but then have ended up at the Brooklyn Museum. And I hope that answers it.
Okay. And are some of Maryhill's stage sets original to the 1940s?
No. And it's interesting you ask that, because the book is a little bit confusing, and that's why one of the online exhibitions on the museum website is specifically about the stage sets. So there were a dozen stage sets created in 1945 that showed in Paris and London and elsewhere in Europe. In 1946, it was a different breed of cat, because, as you know, the fashion houses all create new seasonal works 2 or 3 times a year. So the original 1945 sets were spring summer 1945 fashions. The clothing in 1946 was spring summer 1946 fashions. Only the theater and the homage to René Clair came to North America without revisions, and the other sets were created entirely new. So if you look at the Théâtre de la Mode book, it will show you, if it shows you the recreated fashions and the ones that they calls the lost decors, there are 13 of them. But if you go through the catalogs for both years' shows, you'll see that there's 20 or more. So most of the 1946 stage sets didn't even travel to North America. And during the 6 years that the Théâtre de la Mode was in the basement of the City of Paris department store, something happened, and we do not know what, to the 1946 stage sets. They weren't around when the mannequins came here.
Okay. How many dolls are at Maryhill?
172. And I think, and so we show 3 stage sets at a time. And the stage sets generally are populated with 12 to 20 mannequins. So at any given time, you see 3 stage sets in the neighborhood of 45 to 50 mannequins. And then 2 years later, you can come back and see 3 more sets and that many more mannequins.
Okay, I have comment. 2 of those boxcars are in the Spencer Shops Museum in Spencer, North Carolina.
There you go. And the things that were in those boxcars are probably in a museum somewhere in North Carolina.
And then Joyce Kelly shares, I saw this collection as a senior in high school, 1953, without the stage sets. I still have the black and white photos of the fashions in a U-shaped glass cases. Instrumental in my pursuing a career in fashion design.
That's pretty great. That's really great.
Did any of the 172 travel in Europe during the 40s?
None of the ones that were here traveled in Europe. The Paris show went to London, and then parts of it went elsewhere in Europe, and those were all 1945 mannequins. The next year's runway shows came to New York and then San Francisco and to Maryhill. I had an email from a graduate student today, and I had to correct him because he was implying that the 1946 fashions were somehow inferior, and he was only interested in the originals. And I'm sure that some of the fashion houses who made mannequin clothing in 1945 received those garments back at the end of the 1945 season, but we at Maryhill have no idea where any of them are and only see them preserved in photos.
Okay, how is it decided which cities in each state would receive the boxes?
I have no idea, but I bet if you do an internet search, you'll find guys like me who specialize in boxcar answers.
Only one of the fashion scenes referenced the war. What were the scenes trying to evoke? Is there a theme, or was it based on the artist's interpretations or the fashions themselves?
It was entirely up to the artist to do whatever they wanted to do. And some of them, I think, felt great allegiance to the city of Paris, and that's why so many of the sets are set in specific locations in Paris. But there was no direction given to any of the set designers as to what they should create for the mannequins.
Okay, and it looks like one more question about how large are the sets at Maryhill and how complex are they to put together? Specifically, how large is the set that doesn't fit in your exhibit space?
It isn't so much a question of width, it's a question of height. And that room probably has a 12 or 14-foot ceiling, but I think because there's a large chandelier that hangs down and you have 4 layers of seating, it's probably at least a 15-foot tall set. I think those tend to be, boy, I've never thought to measure, but they're probably, let's say 14 feet wide. And one of our volunteers who helped install them 2 years ago is moving out of the state. And we may be looking for volunteer help to take down and put up 3 sets this winter.
And is Maryhill Museum now open for visitation?
Maryhill is open 7 days a week, God willing, until the 15th of November. And that can always change because the state mandates what we can and can't do. You need to purchase tickets in advance when you go to the museum website. At the very top of the homepage is a banner that allows you to go to the page where you can reserve your online and pay for your online ticket. And then you'll have the option of coming in at either 10 o'clock, 1 p.m. or 3 p.m.
All right. Well, that about wraps up our Q&A. So for anyone who is interested in learning more about the Tdlm mode, we hope that you'll visit Maryhill's website, if not Maryhill Museum itself. And Fort Walla Museum is now open from 12 to 5, Friday through Sunday. And we are going to start posting more events on our event schedule, including next month's Museum After Hours presentation by Indira Cruz of the Sustainable Living Center here in Walla Walla. So please visit our website at fwwm.org, click on the programs and events tabs at the top of the page for information. And also we're in membership renewal season. So if you enjoy our programming, do consider supporting us with a membership. Again, we will be sending out a link to where this talk will be hosted on our website. So that will be available. Steve, if you want, I can include your email for folks looking for more information about this as well. So that about wraps it up. Thank you, Stephen. Is there anything else?
You bet. Happy
All
to.
right. All right. Thanks so much and good night, everybody.